In its long journey from decline to resurgence, Boston has been saddled with the baggage of urban renewal. The most notorious project was the near total destruction of the West End about 60 years ago, but that was preceded by another case of neighborhood removal in the South End. This was an area that used to be called the New York Streets. You can learn about the history through an exhibit currently at the West End Museum. To share the story are the museum's director, Duane, Lucia, and a former New York Streets resident, Gloria, Ganno. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I wanted to start with Gloria. Talk about, I think you've called this kind of a blue-collar neighborhood. What does that mean?
It meant it was a neighborhood of people who, had college educations. All they knew how to do is work physically with their hands, basically. I don't say everyone, but a great number of people worked in factories and places like that.
And this was, I guess, a rather mixed neighborhood in terms of people's ethnic or religious backgrounds, maybe, too.
Yes, it was very much mixed. We had, I can't say all the mixture, but just imagine about 20 different ethnic groups who were there, plus black people were also mixed in with us. And I did some neat research. I read that they were very upset that black people were so mixed with white people, the powers that be in Boston. I read that in my research. One of the things that bothered them about that neighborhood was that. And the reason they took the neighborhood was because they wanted to turn it into a commercial area, because Boston needed that, because companies were leaving, because they wanted to have loading docks. There were those kinds of businesses. So what happened was one of the companies that moved in was the Boston Herald newspaper. They had about 6.5 acres of this 22-acre place, and they had a lot of loading docks, as you can imagine, because of all the newspaper business. Especially back then, it was a bigger thing than it is now.
Duane, talk about how that transformation was allowed, because I guess one of the pretexts was especially if you're thinking of Dover Street along one of the edges of the neighborhood. This is supposed to be Skid Row. This is a slum, so you got to have slum clearance.
Right. Well, it all started in 1949 and was preceded by a number of different attempts to address the housing shortage that was happening nationwide.
With all these veterans coming back from the war.
Yeah,
right?
Veterans coming back, but there was no production during the war, no new housing production, because all the efforts were into the war effort. So Congress had passed the Housing Act of 1949. Reluctantly, Harry Truman got it through. It proceeded from there. As early as 1952, they were starting to plan the New York Streets and the West End projects. There were actually 3 projects. Whitney Street was another one, but that project was funded by the city. The other 2 funded by national federal funds.
And what about the campaign that built up sympathy for this transformation? Because as I recall, wasn't it the Herald or one of its predecessors that had these screaming headlines about all the squalor in this neighborhood and that something had to be done about it?
I think it was a concerted effort by the Boston businesses. And I think one group was the Boston Business Research Bureau, which they felt that industry was leaving the city, so they wanted to somehow preserve what little was left. And actually, the belief is that it did work for a while, and it did keep some of the industry in the city. One classic example in that area was Teradyne, which gave work study to Northeastern. It also kind of welcomed in the whole computer industry.
Well, by disclosure, I had some summer jobs there for a couple of years too at one time. That's right. Gloria, I want to come back to the difference between a slum and a blue-collar neighborhood, because I guess if I could define a slum, I would think of some place with absentee landlords who don't take care of things. They have a bad relationship with the people who live in their buildings. And then you get lots of people who don't have jobs, a lot of criminal activity going on. I mean, all the worst things you can think of. How different was your neighborhood from that kind of nightmare?
Well, there was some of everything. I was fortunate in the buildings I lived in, we didn't have trouble with landlords and things like that, but some people did. Landlords were not fixing things, and partly it was the city's fault. The city let those landlords get away with everything because they had no respect for the people that lived in these neighborhoods. And nobody ever brings that up, but it's the truth. And I've read it. I've told you I've done research, and I know what was going on, not because when I was there, but afterwards and before. So I had a lovely landlady when I was living there. She had a big building. It wasn't a little building like a lot of them were. Had 12 apartments and 2 commercial spaces below. And living in that building, there was one of them was a food store, a food market, and the other one was a butcher right in my building. I just had to go downstairs. 2 doors down, there was an Italian bakery. And not only they had bakery goods like Italian bread and cookies and all that and pastry, they also had a section with imported Italian cold cuts and cheeses, which are far better than what we have here, what we make. And so we were living in sort of in a semi-lap of luxury with food. In the next block, there was a Jewish bakery, Green Friedman's Bakery.
Green Friedman's, I remember some of their bagels fondly.
Yeah, and so you could get, freshly baked breads and bagels and all kinds of things that I can't get anymore. I go to the Stop and Shop and get whatever they have, and however old it is, God knows. So that was part of it. Across the street was there was a produce market, just produce, all fruits, vegetables. That's all the guy sold. So he had to be good because that's how he made his living. That was Mr. Becker. And on and on. There was a shopping area, that's what it was. People from there and around the area shopped for their food there. There were other businesses which I won't mention, but just to give you an example. I was eating better there than when I moved because everything was new and fresh, And then when they told us we had to leave, we didn't leave soon enough, they shut the streetlights off on whoever was left. Imagine coming home on a dark night without even a without even a star in the sky, and you can't even see where you're going. That's what they did to us.
This is BNN News. We're talking about New York streets with Gloria Ganno and Duane Lucia from the West End Museum. Duane, put this chapter in context here, because this happened before the West End, and I'm sure that by the time urban renewal got going in the West End, people knew what happened on New York streets. So how did this influence what happened later?
Well, the planning was simultaneous, but I think that the city kind of got a taste for what they could get away with. As Gloria said, there were quite a bit of injustice to the people who lived there. And I think, because they were worried that Boston was going to become a backwater town, they wanted to move fairly quickly. And it started out with the New York streets being demolished and redeveloped by the Boston Housing Authority. But when they got to the West End and there was more land there was considerably more acreage, 80 plus acres. They created out of the Boston Housing Authority, the Boston Redevelopment Authority, to accelerate the process. So I think the similarities are exactly the same with regard to the people. It's just in the West End it was on a larger scale. And with the goals of the West End were to bring back housing and institutional areas, whereas with the New York streets, it was strictly light industry and no housing.
Gloria, in the 1950s, I think with all of these highways being built, I think that the new standard in housing was to have a single-family house with a nice yard and some trees and gardens around it. You lived in a neighborhood where you had all of these row houses. Everything was dense. Maybe in the summer, people were outside sitting on the steps. What was it like?
Well, of course, I was accustomed to it because I was born in Boston and I always lived in a row house. So when I visited my country cousins, I found it very boring out there. But in any case, we were used to that. When I lived on Florence Street, it wasn't crowded because there was a church and a rectory. It was a small street.
And this is the Florence Street in the South End we're
Yeah,
talking
Mel
about. Right?
King lived on the corner of Florence and Harrison and Washington Street. I lived at number 8, and the church was there, and there was 3 empty lots that were connected, where they were housings at one time, and something happened there, probably a fire. So the church owned those properties. The church maintained those empty lots. We used them for playgrounds. We had a place to actually play. You know, it wasn't easy in the city to have a playground. So we played there. We played all kinds of games. And then the older boys used to have these wonderful handball action on a brick wall there. They'd be fighting like crazy to beat each other.
I know maybe your parents might have known more about this than you were able to take in as a child, but when it was time for your family to get out of there, did they get much help?
No.
What was it like?
Well, my mother was a single parent, and there was just myself and my brother and my mother. My mother worked. My mother never asked for anything. She always worked. It's hard to get away from working when you need the money you're earning to go looking for housing, you know, and so forth. Anyway, we were there too long as far as they were concerned, so then they decided to help us. And what did they do? They took us over to the Columbia Point Projects, which was new at the time. There was nothing there. It was like a wasteland. We were beside a dump. There was no place to buy food, no supermarket. There were no stores and very little bus service. They wanted to take us and put us in there. When they took us over there, I was smart enough to realize this was not a good idea. My mother wasn't the type to speak up, so I told them I refused to live here. And they got very angry with me. I said, I want to go over, if I have to go into a housing project, I want to go to the one in Jamaica Plain where my friends went. Well, we can't do that, you know. What happened? They stopped helping us. They didn't help us anymore because I refused that housing. They were trying to fill that place up beside the dump with no stores and no place to eat, okay? So I was smart enough. I was a teenager. I was smart enough to know this is not a good thing. Well, they didn't want to be bothered with us anymore. So we moved to an apartment in Jamaica Plain, and that's where that happened when the water froze and the pipes froze with the heat, and we had no water and no heat, so we had to get out of there. So they put us in that project in Jamaica Plain. We were a, you know, emergency thing. And so that's where I ended up. After all, I didn't even want to be in the projects, but I had no choice.
Duane, I know we've been showing some of the photographs of the neighborhood, but in addition to that, what else can people look for in this exhibit at the West End Museum?
I think Gloria really hits the nail on the head in describing a lot of the stories, especially from her own perspective. There was one story by Jack Levine, famous Boston artist, whose family started to make a little bit of money, so they moved from the New York streets to Roxbury. And he was mortified because, you know, he couldn't take all the nature surrounding him, and even having a porch, you know, it was such a contrast in what he was used to. So there's a lot of quotes in the exhibit by different people who lived there. Mel King lived there. Louis B. Mayer lived there. He was a junk man at one time. He started his film business with a guy by the name of Joe Mack. And so that's part of the exhibit. The other part of the exhibit is to try to show that the New York streets are actually going full circle, because now you have the ink block there. So they went from regular city blocks to super blocks of the urban renewal era. Now they've taken the super blocks out and they've cut up the streets, and the buildings don't look the same, but they've redesignated as a residential area or a mixed use area, which kind of, it's very expensive. They do put some affordable housing in there, not as much as they probably should. But I think that's the other part of the exhibit that's important. And then finally, the comparison between the West End and the New York streets. I think any West Ender who walks through the exhibit will acknowledge that we weren't project people and they tried to move us to projects. So a lot of people had to go fend for themselves. And there was very little regard for the people who lived and were displaced by the whole slum clearance and urban renewal.
Duane, finally, we should let people know that if they want to get more details about the exhibit, you've got a website they can go to or something on
Yeah,
social
the
media.
westendmuseum.org.
Great. Thank you both very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Duane, Lucia, and Gloria Ganno.